In 1700, the average English person consumed about 4 pounds of sugar per year. By 1800, that number had climbed to 18 pounds. By 1900, it was over 90. And by the time you reach the present day, the average American is consuming somewhere around 126 pounds of added sugar every single year. That is roughly the weight of a grown adult human being dissolved into your food and drink, consumed entirely invisibly in the course of 12 months. And most people have absolutely no idea it is happening. But here is the thing that almost nobody talks about when they talk about sugar. That explosion in consumption did not happen because human beings suddenly developed a new craving. It did not happen because sugar got tastier. It happened because of one of the most deliberate, sustained, and ultimately catastrophic campaigns of scientific manipulation in corporate history. A campaign that took a substance linked to obesity, heart disease, and diabetes, buried that evidence for 30 years, blamed dietary fat instead, reshaped the entire nutritional guidelines of the developed world, and made billions of dollars in the process. And to understand how we got here, you have to start at the very beginning. Not in a factory, not in a boardroom, in a jungle on the other side of the planet 10,000 years ago.
The island of New Guinea sits in the southwestern Pacific Ocean, just north of Australia, covered in dense tropical rainforest that receives some of the heaviest rainfall on Earth. Around 8,000 years before the Common Era, the indigenous peoples living along the island's river valleys were cultivating a tall, thick-stalked grass that grew wild across the lowlands. They cut the stalk, chewed the raw fiber, and extracted a sweet juice that had no real equivalent anywhere else in the ancient world. This was sugarcane in its most primitive form, not refined, not processed, just a plant with an unusually high concentration of sucrose in its tissue, growing wild in the tropics and slowly being domesticated by the people who had figured out what it could do. For thousands of years, that is where the story stayed. Sugarcane spread island by island across the Pacific through Polynesian migration, reaching the Philippines, Indonesia, and the mainland of Southeast Asia without ever being processed into anything more refined than a chewed stalk. The sweetness was local. The plant was not yet a commodity. That was about to change.
Somewhere around 500 years before the Common Era, in what is now the Gupta Empire of northern India, someone figured out that you could do something far more interesting with sugarcane juice than simply drink it. If you crushed the stalks, boiled the liquid down, and allowed it to cool slowly, it crystallized into solid granules. Rough, brown, sticky, nothing like the white powder we recognize today, but solid, portable, storable for months without spoiling, tradable across distances that raw sugarcane could never survive. The Indians called this crystallized product, from which the English word candy eventually descends. And the moment sugar became a solid, it became a commodity. And the moment it became a commodity, it became something that empires would eventually fight over. Indian physicians in this period were already cataloging its medical properties. Ancient Ayurvedic texts describe sugar as a treatment for coughs, bladder disorders, and skin diseases. It was sweet and it was medicine simultaneously, which in the ancient world made it something very close to magic. When Alexander the Great's general Nearchus led a campaign through the Indian subcontinent around 326 years before the Common Era, he sent back dispatches describing a reed that produced honey without the involvement of bees. The Greeks who received that report had no framework for understanding what he was describing. Sugar was so far outside their experience that the only comparison available was to something they already knew. This was the first written European encounter with sugar, and it read like a fairy tale. For the next several centuries, sugar existed in Europe as an object of pure fascination and almost no practical relevance. Arab traders moving through the Levant and Egypt carried small quantities westward, but the quantities were tiny and the prices were enormous. Roman physicians prescribed it for stomach ailments at doses measured in individual grains. The way you might prescribe a rare antibiotic today, it was not food. It was not even really a spice. It occupied a category somewhere between medicine and luxury
that put it beyond the reach of ordinary people entirely. The transformation that changed this calculus was not European at all. It came from the Islamic world, specifically from the extraordinary period of scientific and commercial expansion that historians call the Islamic Golden Age, stretching roughly from the 7th to the 13th century. Arab chemists and agricultural engineers during this period developed the first sophisticated techniques for large-scale sugar refining. They built elaborate crushing mills powered by water and animals. They designed multi-stage boiling and purification processes that removed impurities and produced progressively whiter, finer crystals. They planted sugarcane across the length of the Mediterranean basin, in Persia, in Egypt, along the North African coast, in Sicily, in Spain, creating a production network that for the first time made made refined sugar available in meaningful quantities to the Mediterranean world. And when the Crusaders arrived in the Levant beginning in 1096 and encountered sugar in the markets and kitchens of the cities they were attacking, they reacted the way that Europeans across the following centuries consistently reacted to sugar. They became immediately and completely upset.
Crusader knights hauling sugar back to Europe in the 12th and 13th centuries were carrying something that their home societies had no real context for. Sugar arrived in England, France, and Germany not as food, but as an aristocratic status symbol of almost incomprehensible value. Medieval European monarchs kept detailed written inventories of their sugar supplies the way modern governments account for gold reserves. At royal banquets, confectioners created elaborate sculptural centerpieces from sugar called subtleties, depicting castles, ships, animals, and coats of arms. These were not meant to be eaten. They were meant to be admired as demonstrations that the host possessed something so precious it could be wasted on decoration. Apothecaries locked sugar behind the counter alongside opium, rare imported spices, dispensing it in carefully measured quantities to patients who could afford the prescription. A single pound of refined sugar in 13th century England cost roughly the equivalent of several days of skilled labor wages. If you could put sugar on your table, you were telling everyone in the room exactly who you were. And if you could not afford it, the chances were very high that you had never tasted. The problem with this arrangement, from the perspective of European demand, was geography. Sugarcane requires a tropical or subtropical climate to grow. You cannot grow it in England, you cannot grow it in northern France or the Netherlands or Scandinavia. The supply was entirely dependent on trade relationships with producers in the Islamic Mediterranean, which made it expensive, unreliable, and politically vulnerable to whatever was happening between Christian and Muslim power in any given decade. European monarchs and merchants in the 1400s faced a structural problem that would reshape the entire planet in their attempt to solve it. They needed to find places where sugarcane could grow that were under their own control. Portugal found the first answer, beginning with the colonization of Madeira in the 1420s and expanding to the Canary Islands and then to the island of Sao Tome off the west coast of Africa. Portuguese planters discovered that these Atlantic islands had exactly the right combination of climate and soil sugar. They set up the first European-controlled sugar plantations, and they faced immediately the problem that would define the next 4 centuries of human history. Sugar cultivation is brutal.
Almost unimaginably labor-intensive. Planting, cultivating, harvesting, and processing cane requires enormous quantities of physical labor in extreme heat, operating around the clock during harvest season, when the cut cane must be processed within hours before the juice ferments and spoils. European indentured workers could not or would not sustain this pace, so Portugal turned to enslaved Africans, and Sao Tome became the testing ground for the plantation slavery system that would define the Atlantic world for the next 300 years.
Here is the part that most histories of sugar rush past because it is genuinely difficult to sit with. When Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic in 1492, he brought sugarcane cuttings on his second voyage specifically because everyone involved understood that the Caribbean climate was perfect for it. The decision to plant sugar in the Americas was not an accident or an afterthought. It was the explicit commercial plan from the beginning. And the decision to use enslaved African labor to work those plantations was not an economic necessity that emerged over time. It was the established model already proven in the Atlantic island, deliberately transplanted to a new and vastly larger territory. Between the early 1500s and the formal abolition of the transatlantic slave trade in the 19th century, historians estimate that somewhere between 12 and 13 million people forcibly transported from Africa to the Americas. The majority of them ended up on sugar plantations. The conditions were catastrophic. On a typical Caribbean sugar plantation in the 17th and 18th centuries, the average life expectancy of an enslaved person after arrival was between 7 and 10 years. 7 to 10 years. Plantation owners calculate explicitly,
And in writing that historians have recovered, that it was economically more efficient to work enslaved people to death and purchase replacements than to provide the food, rest, and medical care that might extend their lives. This calculation was made possible entirely by the profitability of sugar. Sugar did not just use slavery as a labor source. Sugar made slavery economically rational to the people running the system, and that economic rationality is what gave the institution its terrible durability.
by the mid-17th century, the Caribbean had been transformed. Barbados, Jamaica, Haiti, Cuba, Saint Domingue, Martinique, and Guadeloupe had all become sugar factories of almost incomprehensible productivity, worked by enslaved populations that outnumbered the European colonial populations by ratios of 10 or 20 to 1. Tiny Barbados,
an island you could drive across in under an hour, was by the 1660s generating more revenue for the English crown than all of the North American colonies combined. And it was doing it almost entirely on the back of sugar and the people being destroyed to produce it. The wealth flowing back to Europe from these plantations was staggering. It built the Georgian townhouses of Bristol and Liverpool. It funded the commercial banks of London. It endowed universities. It paid for the country estates of families whose descendants still own significant portions of England today. The triangular trade that connected European manufactured goods to the African coast, enslaved people to the Caribbean, and sugar back to Europe was the dominant commercial engine of the Atlantic world for nearly 2 centuries. And sugar was the thing that made the whole structure profitable enough to sustain.
And then, in the late 18th century, something happened that the colonial system was completely unprepared for. The people being worked to death on the sugar plantations of St. Domingue, the western half of the island of Hispaniola, and the most productive sugar colony in the entire Caribbean, decided they had had enough. In August of 1791, a coordinated uprising that would become the Haitian Revolution, the only successful large-scale slave revolt in the history of the modern world. Over the following 13 years, enslaved and formerly enslaved people fought against French colonial forces, against Spanish and British intervention, against Napoleon's own brother-in-law leading an army of 40,000 soldiers sent specifically to reimpose slavery, and they won. In 1804, Haiti became the first free black republic in the Western Hemisphere. The plantation system on the island was gone. France had lost its most profitable colony overnight, and Napoleon, who had been dreaming of a French sugar empire stretching from the Caribbean to the North American interior, was forced to completely recalculate his ambitions. Without St. Domingue's sugar revenue, holding the Louisiana territory made no financial sense. He sold it to the United States in 1803 for $15 million, roughly 4 cents per acre. The Haitian Revolution, born on a sugar plantation, accidentally doubled the size of the United States. Napoleon had a second problem. Britain's Royal Navy had blockaded French ports, cutting off access to Caribbean sugar entirely. France needed sweetness, and it needed a domestic source. This is where the story takes a turn that most people have never heard. A German chemist named Andreas Sigismund Marggraf had demonstrated in 1747 that European sugar beets contained sucrose, chemically identical to cane sugar. His student, Franz Achard, had developed optical extraction process. Napoleon seized on this work with characteristic urgency, ordering tens of thousands of acres of French farmland converted to beet cultivation, establishing research institutions dedicated to improving yields, and offering significant cash bounties to farmers and processors. By 1813, France was producing beet sugar at industrial scale. The millennia-old monopoly that tropical sugarcane had held over the world's supply of crystallized sweetness was broke. Beet sugar versus cane sugar, temperate versus tropical, European farms versus Caribbean plantation. The rivalry drove prices down and production up through the 19th century, and cheaper sugar meant something that the people producing it had not fully anticipated. It meant that for the first time in history, ordinary working people could afford to eat it every. But before we get to the modern crisis, there is one chapter in sugar's story that almost never gets the attention it deserves, and it sits right in the middle of the 19th century at the intersection of chemistry, warfare, and pure desperation. When Napoleon ordered the development of beet sugar, he was solving an immediate military problem. The thing he accidentally set in motion had consequences far beyond his blockade. The competition between cane sugar and beet sugar that emerged over the following decades did not just drive prices down, it created entirely new agricultural economies across temperate Europe and eventually the American Midwest, where sugar beet cultivation became a significant industry by the early 20th century. It forced the Caribbean plantation economies to adapt or collapse, since they could no longer rely on European markets paying premium prices for cane sugar when cheaper beet sugar was available domestically. And it demonstrated something that the people running the global sugar trade in 1800 would have considered essentially impossible, that the crop which had driven colonial expansion, the transatlantic slave trade, and 3 centuries of Caribbean plantation economics was not actually irreplaceable. The monopoly was contingent. It always had been. The geography that made tropical sugar the only viable source of crystallized sweetness turned out to be a historical accident, not a permanent feature of chemistry. The abolition of the transatlantic slave trade by Britain in 1807 and the subsequent decades-long campaign to enforce that abolition against resistant Caribbean planters and Brazilian producers created a labor crisis across the plantation system that sugar producers attempted to solve in various ways, some of which were only marginally better than what they replaced. Indentured laborers from India were shipped to Caribbean colonies by the hundreds of thousands,
under contracts that technically guaranteed their return passage, but in practice trapped many of them in conditions that differed from slavery primarily in legal classification rather than in lived experience. Chinese laborers were brought to Cuba under similar arrangement. The plantation system was searching for any mechanism that would allow it to continue producing sugar at the volumes the market demanded while navigating the political pressure against the labor model that had made those volumes possible.
What finally broke the Caribbean plantation system's dominance was not abolition or competition from beet sugar or moral pressure from European reformers. It was the same thing that eventually breaks every economic system built on a single commodity produced through forced or coerced labor. Industrial technology made the labor-intensive production model obsolete. Steam-powered mills could crush cane at speeds and volumes that no human workforce could match. Mechanical harvesters, though imperfect for sugarcane's particular biology, reduced the labor intensity of the harvest phase. Centrifugal separation technology replaced the slow, heat-intensive crystallization process that had required constant human attention. By the late 19th century, the combination of beet sugar competition and industrial processing technology had definitively ended the era in which Caribbean plantation owners could generate extraordinary returns from sugarcane cultivation. The wealth had moved. It had moved into industrial food processing, into refining operations in European and American cities, into the supply chain that connected raw commodity production to the packaged consumer products that were just beginning to fill the shelves of the first modern grocery store.
The industrialization of sugar consumption in 19th century Britain is one of the stranger stories in economic history. As sugar became cheap enough for working-class households to buy regularly, it did not replace expensive food. It combined with the other thing that was becoming cheap and ubiquitous at exactly the same moment: tea. Britain was importing enormous quantities of tea from China, but tea on its own is bitter and, for many unpleasant. Sweetened with sugar, it became not just palatable, but addictive. And by the mid-19th century, the sweetened tea break had become so embedded in British working-class culture that factory owners and industrialists actively encouraged it because it kept workers alert and productive through long shifts without requiring employers to pay for actual meals. Sugar was the fuel of industrial capital. It provided fast, cheap calories that simulated satiety without providing nutrition, and it kept the machinery of industrial production moving at a cost that the working class could absorb. The people profiting from this arrangement were not nutritionists. They were mill owners, and the arrangement worked out extremely well for them.
The 20th century turned this dynamic into something far more systematic and far more dangerous. As processed food manufacturing expanded after the Second World War, sugar became not just a sweetener, but a structural ingredient in an enormous range of products. Bread, salad dressing, pasta sauce, canned vegetables, breakfast cereals, flavored yogurt, granola bars, ketchup. Products that had no obvious reason to contain sugar were quietly reformulated to include it because sugar enhanced flavor, extended shelf life, improved texture, and, most importantly, made products more compulsively consumable. The food industry had discovered what the sugar industry had known since the beginning. People do not just like sweets, they crave it in a way that overrides rational judgment. And that craving can be engineered into products to drive repeat purchasing. By 1970, the average American was consuming over 100 pounds of sugar per year. The number was climbing every decade, and the health consequences were starting to become visible in the data.
Here is where the story becomes genuinely hard to absorb. As early as the 1950s, researchers studying heart disease and obesity were finding consistent links between sugar consumption and negative health outcomes. The data was not ambiguous. It was not preliminary. It was accumulating across multiple independent studies pointing in the same direction, and the sugar industry knew about it. Internal documents from the Sugar Research Foundation, which were not made public until researchers at the University of California, San Francisco discovered them in 2016, show that industry executives were tracking the emerging science closely from the early 1950s onward. They understood what it meant, and they made a deliberate decision about how to respond.
In 1967, the Sugar Research Foundation paid 3 researchers at Harvard University, including the chairman of Harvard's nutrition department, the equivalent of approximately $50,000 in today's money, to review the existing literature on sugar, fat, and heart disease, and publish their conclusions in the New England Journal of Medicine, one of the most prestigious medical publications in the world. The review, published under the researchers' own names with no disclosure of the industry funding, concluded that dietary fat was the primary driver of heart disease. It explicitly dismissed the evidence linking sugar. The study was
was not a fraud in the sense that the data was fabricated. It was a fraud in the sense that the researchers cherry-picked which studies to include, downplayed contradictory findings, and reached a conclusion that the funding source had predetermined before the review began, and it worked. For the next 3 decades, American nutritional policy was built on the foundation that fat was the enemy. The government issued dietary guidelines warning against fat. Food companies removed fat from their products and replaced it with sugar to maintain flavor. Low fat became the standard recommendation of physicians and public health officials, and the result, playing out across the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s, was an explosion in rates of obesity, type 2 diabetes, and metabolic disease that public health researchers are still trying to reverse today.
The sugar industry had not just hidden the evidence, it had successfully replaced it with a false story that redirected 40 years of public health policy away from the actual problem. Meanwhile, in the early 1970s, a separate development was quietly transforming the American food supply in a way that most consumers never noticed existed. Japanese scientists had developed a method for converting cornstarch into a liquid sweetener called high fructose corn syrup. American corn production was already massively subsidized by the federal government, which meant corn-derived sweeteners could be produced far more cheaply than cane sugar. By 1984, both Coca-Cola and Pepsi had switched from cane sugar to high fructose corn syrup in their American formulations. Within a decade, high fructose corn syrup had replaced cane sugar in virtually every category of processed food in the United States. Americans were consuming more sugar than ever before in history through a delivery mechanism that most of them did not know existed, produced from a crop they had never associated with sweetness, whose long-term metabolic effects were not yet well understood. The substitution happened almost entirely below the level of public awareness. The ingredient lists changed, the sweetness did not. Consumption continued to climb.
The story of sugar is ultimately a story about how thoroughly a substance can reshape the world around it when the economics are right and the accountability. It reshaped the geography of production in the South Pacific. It drove the crystallization technologies of ancient India. It built the trade routes of the Islamic Golden Age. It funded the Venetian Republic. It motivated the colonization of the Atlantic island. It created the economic demand for the transatlantic slave trade and made that trade profitable enough to last 3 centuries. It triggered the only successful mass slave revolt in modern history, and through that revolt accidentally doubled the size of the United States. It became the fuel that kept the industrial working class moving through 18-hour factory shifts. And then, when it began to reveal itself as a significant driver of chronic disease, the industry that profited from it spent 50 years and hundreds of millions of dollars making sure that nobody in a position of authority would be able to say so clearly and be believed.
10,000 years ago, someone in a valley on the island of New Guinea cut a stalk of wild grass, put it in their mouth, and tasted something that no technology, no refining, no processing, no marketing, and no corporate research foundation has ever been able to improve on: pure sweetness. The grass was just doing what plants do. It was us who turned it into the most consequential crop in human history. It is sitting in your kitchen right now, in your cereal, in your bread, in your salad dressing, in the yogurt you probably think of as healthy. And the industry that put it there has known for a very long time what it does to you. The question is whether you, knowing that now, changes anything at all. If this kind of history is what you are here for, hit subscribe and leave a comment telling me which part of this surprised you the most. There is a lot more where this came from.